Good afternoon. Welcome, 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 everyone. You're in for an incredible opportunity to be engaged today. I want to thank you for tuning in to Leaders Over Lunch. You know, we're so grateful to be able to bring you this series. And today we're talking about racial equity and the pathway forward. Now, I'm Dr. J. Keith Motley. I typically serve as Chancellor Emeritus and a professor over at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, but I'm so grateful to be able to be a co-host today and serve as consultant president and CEO for the incredible Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. And my co-host today is the chairman of that board, um, is attorney Joseph Feaster Jr. Not only is he chairman, but he's also historian. He has a knack for understanding both what has happened historically for the Urban League as well as the NAACP here in Boston. And so it's a great source for us. Now remember, today, I know you're saying, Doc, every time you come on here, you say you're getting better at the question and answer feature of this. And I want to get my questions in. I'm tired of getting these emails from you and texts from you and all that. We're going to do it. We're going to get better and better. I promise you. Last month, we got in a couple questions. Today, we'll try to do more. I want to thank the staff who helped to put this together. You know, Natalie Haywood, who's running around in the back room, Alvin Peters, who's there, but also Uda. Uda is back here making sure all the production is going well and all. And we have to say to William Watkins, thank you for not only pushing us around this concept of Leaders Over Lunch, but also making sure all is well. Before we get started, however, we just want to say that we've lost some incredible people. I know that you've lost incredible giants in your lives. And so we want to take a moment to not only think of those individuals who you may have lost in your life, but also to think of two incredible individuals who just meant so much to the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. And so we want to start out by talking about and just saying, as we give a minute of silence, we want to do that in honor of former Guild President Beverly Gibson, who not only was an incredible family, mother, someone who just gave her life to not only the Urban League, but also to 22 years of service as a probation officer here in Moore in this city, but also Doris Bunting, former Massachusetts State Representative, but also the CEO of the Boston Housing Authority and more and more and more. She was the first African-American woman to hold either of those positions. And so we give honor to them and all of your family members as we begin this process. Just a moment of silence for them. So remember, this is an hour-long show. We invite you to enjoy lunch. We're going to be, every time we have our panelists talk, we're going to go to our lunch and sip on our tea. But we also want to thank you for joining us today. And as I mentioned, we've had some incredible and esteemed guests today. But what is Leaders Over Lunch? It's a conversation with men and women in leadership, in business, government, community development, and religion. Our goal is to have a candid conversation about our strengths, our weaknesses, our threats, and our opportunities, and what is important to all of us. Our guests today, we're going to have sort of an intergenerational conversation between folk who are just serious about their community and both have had the honor of serving as director of the William Monroe Trotter Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and doing other incredible things. But I had to just bring that up. And so we're going to start out with Dr. James Jennings, Professor Emeritus, Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University, but also someone who served as the Dean of the College of Community and Public Service. He's written incredible books, but also authored so many reports for our community that woke us up about the data and statistics in that regard. And so the person who is now leading at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and has just been on fire with his work, Dr. Kito Swan is not only a professor in our Africana Studies Department and an incredible author and all of that, HBCU, educated, talented young man, and we're just so proud of him. So we got both of them together, and the chairman and I figured, let's get started. Let's get them rolling. Chairman, you ready?
Always ready there. Amongst all of these doctors that I have on this particular program, that's why I had to put on a shirt and tie to make sure that I can be distinguished amongst these group of doctors. I may have to change that JD into a doctor or come join you with a PhD. I don't know. But in any event, I'm so happy to co-host with Dr. Motley. He and the team that he mentioned are doing such an extraordinary job at the Urban League in every respect. I want to thank William Watkins and Charles Stewart and Uder and Natalie for the work that they're doing. But I'm so happy to be here with these two distinguished panelists that we have here today. I have personal interactions with Dr. Jennings. He made me intelligent by working with him on when he was the director of the Institute, by putting me on some of the, being a research assistant there. And I'm so grateful for that. I was able to show my mother my name in lights, with Dr. Jennings. And I'm so happy to see Dr. Swan, who will be carrying on that particular legacy. But before we get into the questions, I have to comment about Doris Bunte. Doris Bunte served on the Boston branch NAACP with me when I was president of the Boston branch NAACP. She was involved with the Urban League as well. She was a distinguished legislator. She served as an administrator of the Boston Housing Authority, which I had the good fortune to be able to be the interim administrator at a point in time. I work with Dr. Jennings now doing things with the Boston Housing Authority. So the moment of silence is well worth it. She and her cohorts, Mel King, Sandra Graham, and Doris Bunte, were distinguished legislators who made much of what we do now so meaningful, and the advances that we made were as a result of the works that they did while they were legislators. So I can't say enough about Doris Bunte. But we now have our good doctors here, Dr. Jennings and Dr. Swan. And so I think it'd be helpful, as we like to do here, is to have our viewing audience to know about the work that each of you do. And I know that it's extensive. You've written books, you've done bunches of surveys on community issues. Let folks know exactly what you do. And I'm going to go to the senior side. So we now have to invoke that at a period of time, as Dr. Motley says. So I'm going to jump to the senior side first. So Dr. Jennings, you are on.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. It's really an honor and a pleasure. And especially thank you for those really kind words about our giants who have joined their ancestors. Both individuals have had a tremendous impact. And people have mentioned some of the reports that I've written. Actually, Doris Bunte was involved with some of those reports.
Amen.
So I will miss her in body, but not in spirit. So thank you very much for those kind words. And again, it's an honor to be here to work with Dr. Swan on this show. I guess there are two projects that I'm involved with right now that viewers may be interested in. One, I've been helping the city, actually the Department of Neighborhood Development, and now other people in city government, to finish Boston's assessment of fair housing. And this is big news, because an assessment of fair housing that is comprehensive can be a tool to fight against gentrification and displacement. We were able to get a victory just a few months ago, signed by the Boston Zoning Commission and the next day the mayor, to incorporate fair housing language into our zoning regulations. And so Boston became the first city in the country to actually do this. And the work is still going on, and we're going to try to complete this, cross the T's and dot the I's over the next several weeks. Another project that I'm involved with, again at the BHA, is looking to expand services for our Section 8 voucher holders in terms of information, in terms of housing stability. And that's something that I've been working with Joseph on, and something that I think is also going to put BHA into the national limelight in a very positive way.
Dr. Swan, why don't you, I know you're, I don't know the length of time that you've now been here with the Monroe Trotter, and you're at that distinguished institution, UMass Boston. Please tell us what exactly what you have on your agenda as far as what you're going to be doing going forward as well.
Thank you, Joseph. And once again, it's a pleasure to be here. I became director of the Trotter Institute last February, so just had the anniversary. I came on board at UMass Boston to be professor of Africana Studies fall 2019. I'm a scholar of the African diaspora, Black internationalism. I've done work on Black social movements in the Caribbean. I just published a book about Black power, Black internationalism, and environmental justice that pretty much took me across the world. To complete traveled across Africa, the Pacific, Australia, Papua New Guinea, throughout the Caribbean. And so for me, much of my career has been defined by being an historian of the African diaspora. That's kind of the lens in which I see the world. I've also done work around public policy, and coming on board with the Trotter been an amazing transformation to have the opportunity as an historian to now, use my research and my lens to have direct impact on Black communities in real time. Has been fascinating. But I would say I wouldn't advocate that anyone become director of an institute a month before COVID-19 hits and send us remotely. That was a great challenge, but also, realize this was part of the work of the Institute, is to look at the critical issues impacting Black communities in Boston and find ways to address them. So some of the first work we did was releasing policy briefs where we analyzed Boston public health data, looking at disparities among Black communities in Boston compared to other ethnic groups. And we found that those disparities reflected other vulnerabilities that have plagued Black people, not just in Boston, but across the world. This past year, I'm really excited. I was part of a team that was commissioned by Bermuda's government to look into an inquiry for historic land losses in the island. And I had to, pretty much give testimony for a public audience around a case of reparations for Black communities who had the land taken by the tourist industry and also by the building of a U.S. World War II base in Bermuda. And that's the kind of, lens that I'm really excited to hear Dr. Janice talk about issues around housing, because for me, I think that the question of land, housing, reparations are all part of the work that we need to be doing, and finding creative ways to address local issues, but often also looking at the diasporic connections that impact those local issues as well. So at the Trotter, we're doing a study right now on historic police brutality activism in Boston by analyzing Boston public Boston police data, but also really looking at the Black organizations that historically stood up against police brutality. Because from my perspective, it's important to not let oppression have the last word in the work that we do, and that's some of the things that hopefully we can talk about this afternoon as well.
Well, listen, man, we're so grateful to you both for being here, and Dr. Swan, we're so grateful for your mentioning the word reparation. We have a lot of audience members who've been on the chair and I about never getting to the reparations question every time we come on. So we got to it early and we're going to get to it later. But also I want folk to know that Charles Stewart is in the chat and he is making sure that lots of information, and we appreciate you, Charles, for being in the chat. I did notice that someone is indicating that they can't get in to their video. And so if someone can help make sure that that person gets into their video, that would be great. So, Dr. Swan, build on what you were talking about, the impact on Black and Brown communities. And and I'm going to have you, Dr. Jennings, coming to that as well. What about the last 5 years? What's been the impact on our people?
That's a great question, and for me, I feel like it's been a reminder of the political, the economic, the health, the spatial, the social vulnerabilities that have plagued our communities for, quite frankly, hundreds of years. I think Black and Brown communities have been in a very precarious position around systemic racism, that despite our relative successes, still structure the quality of our collective lives. I think it's been a reminder that these structural issues remain. And, for me, it's striking, right? Because, I just think about much of the national discourse around Obama's presidency was about a post-racial society, at least from the national level. I haven't heard that term used in the past 5 years. So I think, for nationally, I think it's been a reminder of these systemic issues, but I think for Black and Brown people ourselves, I think we still were aware of these, the prevalent issues that have plagued us. One of our colleagues at UMass, Linnell Thomas, wrote a fascinating article about COVID-19. She called it hurricane. She related the pandemic to, Hurricane Katrina. And she talked about how
honored to get her was because we were blessed to get her because of Hurricane Katrina. So there were some blessings that came out of it.
Right. And she talked about the same vulnerabilities that came out of, that were really visible in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, reemerged in the moment of COVID-19. So you combine this pandemic of the health pandemic, the very visceral police pandemic, political pandemic. It's a reminder of where we've been before.
Dr. Jennings?
Yeah, so COVID-19 has an interesting narrative around it. We know that it exposed and exacerbated inequalities, especially racial inequities. But we knew about these racial inequalities and equities way before COVID-19. And so to me, it was interesting that the narrative is, oh, I didn't know these things existed. And part B of that narrative is that actually COVID-19 has made things worse. I, for one, am very concerned, for example, in how the vaccinations are being rolled out with the absence of a racial equity lens. And so we have all these, universal programs, and Black and Brown people are still being left out. And so racial inequities are becoming worse continually. I think that the wave of police killings that were exposed, not that these police killings were new, but they were exposed, I think did shock a lot of people. But again, it did not shock a lot of people in Black and Brown communities. And that's going to be a long time struggle to turn that situation around. And I guess the other thing that we see more clearly is the racial wealth gap. And again, we can't really just talk about this in terms of the last 5 years. Whether Democratic or Republican administrations, that racial wealth gap has been intensified. It's become wider and wider, and is very much connected to the discussion around reparations.
Well, I know that we're going to get to reparations. Has come up twice now, and I'm going to leave that for Dr. Motley to handle it, since they constantly beat him up, and I prefer that. If they're going to do that, he gets paid. I'm volunteering, so therefore that's fine. But we talk about the last 5 years, but in the more immediate time since January 6th, there are certain things that have happened on the national scene which have had a significant impact. And so I want both of you to talk about how the insurrection at the Capitol, the outcome of the impeachment and the acquittal, tell us anything about what to expect in the future. And I want to add a caveat to that, because I just saw before coming on the program, I read something which says the NAACP and Representative Benny Thompson out of Mississippi are suing that guy who was in the White House that former mayor that was in New York. I call them the poor boys, not the Proud Boys, and the other group. They're suing them under a Ku Klux Klan act that exists. So, just want you both to talk about it. I'm going to, since I started with you first, Dr. Jennings, when I spoke, I'm gonna come to you, Dr. Swan, and then to you, Dr. Jennings, to speak to that. What does all of that tell us about what bodes for us in the future?
Thanks again. You know, it's hard to not think about the response of primarily Black and brown persons around Black Lives Matter in terms of, you know, the police response to those protests of the summer, and compare that with what we saw in DC with the insurrection. You know, and I spent, you know, a number of years at Howard University, over a decade. And so, you know, DC is you know, it's still my backyard. It also was a reminder there are two DCs sometimes. You know, it's the capital DC, but you know, being in DC in Black areas, you know, it was mad quiet. But you know, we've always seen the capital area as a space of, you know, surveillance, right? As a space of, don't have those kind of conversations on your phone, right? Because they got to be listening. It's next to the Capitol. Drive slower, you know. You know, all those kind of, but to see this contrast and imagining, you know, imagine if this was crowds of Black people, what the response would be. It's hard not to think about, you know, the state violence we probably would have seen if these are Black crowds. At the same time, you know, in terms of the outcome, I think we should expect more of the same in the future. You know, it's hard, as someone like myself who's an historian, it's hard not to be cynical about, you know, notions of change or things being different. You know, for me, I usually see reminders as cycles. It's clear that there are two sets of rules when it comes to white America and Black America, whether it's how the media treats us, police, the state. And so, you know, I wasn't surprised Trump was, you know, acquitted. I think maybe for the Democratic Party, it was about putting it on historical record. And I do think that was important. But I think we'll continue to see, you know, this double standard, because as Dr. Jennings mentioned, this is part of the fabric of what makes America America. This double standard between how white American and Black America is treated.
So clearly, what this showed was, as Dr. Swan alluded to, is the divisiveness in the country. A divisiveness that I think is pointing the country towards two roads. And we're at the precipice of trying to figure out which road to take. We know which road we want to take, but there are people and interests that want to take this country to a road which continues the racial double standards and justifies the racial double standards. So clearly there's divisiveness. Now, what do we do about that divisiveness if you want the country to take the more positive role? I think we have to begin building and strengthening and expanding a progressive politics. It cannot be politics simply, I hate Trump. I hate Trump politics is narrow, and it's not going to really move the country towards a progressive vision where housing and public schools and public health and public safety do not reflect these continuing and intensifying racial and ethnic and linguistic and immigrant inequities.
Well, I'm so grateful to hear that. I noticed in the chat that there are lots of collaborations that people are talking about. In fact, Prince Hall Grand Lodge has been doing food distribution and have been doing COVID testing and vaccines on the future horizons. So we're so grateful to them for doing that. What are some collaborative strategies that you guys may suggest using to address issues that plague our communities?
Well, I'll go first, Dr. Swan.
By all means,
You're on
please
mute.
do. Please do.
You're on mute. Again, I think I think we have to look at social policy in not from silos, but in ways that interconnect people. How is housing connected to health, which it is? How is it connected to our public schools? How is it connected to the environment and climate change? I think the more we push intersectional visions of social policies, it opens the door for greater collaboration across communities. It's not, we're not going to move forward with a sort of what people have described as a piece of the pie politics. I want a piece of the pie. That pie has to be challenged, and it has to be challenged in ways that benefit everyone.
That's a great analogy. It's lunchtime, and I would love some pie, though, some physical pie.
And we didn't get any
Once we're
lunch, by
done.
the way.
Exactly, right,
We didn't get any
exactly.
lunch.
It's leaders over lunch for everybody but the panelists.
Oh,
Exactly. Right. But I agree with Dr. Jennings in terms of the collaboration. I think the moment of COVID-19, I think when we unpack the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer, those protests didn't happen without all kind of collaborations across genders, identities, ethnic groups. One of the things that I'm excited about at UMass Boston is the ability to work with other ethnic-based research institutes, such as the Gaston Institute for Latinx Studies, Institute for Study of Asian Americans, and also Native Americans as well. And one of the things we're actually working on is an ethnic studies curriculum for the Boston Public School System. And we're each working on a separate ethnic group. And in doing that work, it's amazing to see the potential and some of the work that's already being done. From the lens of the Trotter, what I've been advocating for is a research agenda around restorative justice that we can't neglect, even as we're doing, the important on-campus work that also requires collaboration. There's a research agenda that requires collaboration. Just one example, the Gaston produced a really phenomenal report on the experiences of Afro-Latinos in Massachusetts. I was invited to do the preface and we're presenting that report during this month, but it's those kind of, research-based reports that could, work with community-based collaborations that I think are essential. As Dr. Jennings said, the road that we want to take. And I think, looking at, for example, Afro-Latinx community, that's a great intersection for Black and Brown collaborations. I think that's one of the critical spaces we need to investigate intentionally about doing work around.
I'm going to go to the Q&A because I just want to show folks that when we have bright people on here, but I also want them to know that I have a list which includes all of the questions that they've asked, but I want to highlight what they've asked, and I'm probably going to move because that's one of the things co-hosts can do. We can move our thinking around and see how it flows because people are asking some critical questions. I just want to state the questions here in case they don't come up. I'm not sure exactly how that works. So there's a question from another urban leaguer, Ron Marlowe, in terms of an urban leaguer, person who has been involved in state government and a leader in this community. And he had asked about COVID. He said, as COVID-19 has exposed the economic and social disparities that Black people face, what should be the top 3 agenda items on which we should focus on in 2021? I'm going to go to that question. That's question 8 on the list that Dr. Motley and I have, but I'm going to move that and answer that question. Priscilla Williams asks, where can an individual seek direct support and resources to battle systems of oppression and aggression right now, i.e. BHA, DTA, child support, Suffolk University? Maybe there's a concern that she has there. And then Masuri Abdulhalik, a young man who I know that from the Abdulhalik family very, very well. He's an educator, lives in Roxbury, raising his family. And he asked, as a Black man who is a long-term resident of Roxbury and a BPS teacher and teacher leader, what are some specific things I can do to help improve the quality of life for Black and Brown people in Boston? And the last one, Priscilla Williams again, what can be done to call equal attention to financial and economic genocide on women and children under the BLM umbrella? So those are all encompassing, and I'm going to take you to what we have as our question 8 here, which says, okay, I want to get to the point that Ron Marlowe asked. We talked about some of the issues around collaboration. We talked about what some of the national issues have the impact on Black and brown people. We talked about police reform. Dr. Jennings, you raised that, and Dr. Swan amplified that. The question is now, that being the case, with all of the myriad of issues that have been pointed out by our people in the Q&A, we know we experience as Black and brown people. We see the change that's taking place or will take place in this decade. What are some of the issues, critical issues, that we need to be highlighted or be addressing right now? To you, Dr. Jennings, then to you, Dr. Swan.
Thank you. Well, and that's a really important question. As I mentioned earlier, just one small, not a small example, but we have to use a racial equity lens as we think about what solutions are most effective for Black and brown people and ultimately all people. Up to this point, we have not really been using a racial equity lens, at least at the state level. I think we also have to expand economic opportunities, which are related to closing the racial wealth gap. And I say economic opportunities because COVID-19 also showed that Black and brown people are in the lowest paying jobs, the most upfront jobs, and yet when they get sick, it's life shattering. So we need to expand economic opportunities for Black and brown people, working class people, people who are just struggling to raise families. I think those are at least two things under the umbrella of COVID-19 that are important to pursue.
And I would just add, for me, this is COVID-19 for me was also a reminder of why diasporas matter. One of the things I don't think we've talked about enough is how Africa and the Caribbean actually handled COVID-19. I think with so much, trying to just catch up, to the racial inequities, that we can't often think ahead or get ahead, and we know the beast is coming. And so one of the things that Africa did, and part of this was out of trauma from Ebola and other, really destructive pandemics. There was also already some sense of a structure on how to handle a pandemic of this nature. And several leaders of Africa met, health directors, including a large amount of African women in the health fields. They met in January of 2020 to discuss a global, a continental-wide response to COVID-19. I don't think we've looked enough at what we've done as Black people in challenging some of these issues. And I'm not trying to paint the picture that, everything was great with COVID. Africa lost lives, so did folks in the Caribbean. But for me, that's one of the things I thought about a lot in terms of what are the solutions that we have within ourselves and our diasporas for challenging some of these really, broad, terrible pandemics, whether they're socially or health-wise, that will return because we're still in that moment. And I think one of the reasons why we haven't been looking is based upon that same lack of racial equity, that we're often not, encouraged to look at ourselves for having solutions. There was a lot of discussions around what type of medicines or plants were available, the networks that our communities, drew back on to just maintain or survive, that are still surviving. I think, Dr. Jennings is right again when we think about the vaccine. This is another moment that it's hard to get ahead of, but we should also be paying attention to how other Black countries or spaces are dealing with, this issue.
So do me a favor, Dr. Jennings, and just tell us what you mean by the racial equity lens. I don't want to have that question
Sure.
in some person's mind on this call who may not understand what you are talking about when you speak in that regard.
Well, I guess I could start by saying that we live in a society with racial hierarchy. We live in a society that has built wealth based on racism, based on racial double standards, based on things that the federal government has done or not done. So we certainly have a system of racial inequality that is embedded. Racial equity is a response to that. Racial equity means that we have to acknowledge that history, we have to acknowledge the contemporary manifestations of that history, and we need concrete solutions. And I have to say that I was actually very pleased when our outgoing mayor, Marty Walsh, issued his executive order on racial equity. It's a very comprehensive statement that I think people should look at, grab it, and run with it. So again, when I think of how COVID-19, the responses, just the other day, there was an issue around whether households with asthma, where they should be on the line of vaccinations. Now, if you use a racial equity lens, you know that at least in Boston, the asthma hotspots are precisely where Black and Latinx people live. And so if you say, well, asthma, that's not so important, you are implicitly saying, really, Black and brown people with this condition are not really a priority here. We have the Gillette Stadium sort of place to go get vaccinations, and then our own very Reginald Lewis Center, and it's still not reaching people of color. And we need to say that has to change.
Yes, and so yes, I'm grateful that you gave us that example. So what about reparations? What about reparations in its role in solving the problems or the issues for our people? Why or why not? Let's talk a little bit about reparations. Hey, Dr. Swan, why don't you start this one out?
Man, it's tough, right? It's tough. Can reparations solve the problems of the Black community? Honestly, for me, perhaps it depends. Will it solve all the problems? It depends. If you think about what is reparations, are we talking about reparations as a check? Are we talking about, more broader issues? I think one of the things that Dr. Jens is also referencing is environmental injustices that impact Black and brown communities. We have the asthma because we live in a certain neighborhood that has certain environmental inequities that are also racialized. So is reparations also about changing the space, the spaces of Black communities? What is clear is that, at least in the British Caribbean, at 1834, British slave owners were giving, billions of pounds for slavery. They were compensated for ending slavery, and Black people received nothing. And that wealth, and not just that wealth, but that wealth is part of the foundation of the capitalist inequities that we face. So there has to be some form of redress. But it depends on how it's received. There have been for generations, I think Black people have raised ideas. This cuts at the fabric of what it means to be Black, not just in the United States, but in the African diaspora. To draw back again on the Caribbean, so Hilary Beckles of the University of West Indies has been actively working around reparations. They secured some form of reparations from a number of universities in the UK that benefited from the slave trade. So there have been some type of redress in terms of education systems, but does it solve the entire problems? No, not at all. They're addressing some of these issues, but the root cause of the broad impact of slavery and the slave trade has been so vast that I think we can talk about specific problems, but the entire issue that impacts Black people is not just economic as well. It's a broader set of, does reparations cure white supremacy or white state violence? We probably say no. So I think it's a really complicated issue it's worth studying, but I would be under no illusions that reparations simply solves every issue that we have as a people.
I couldn't agree with Dr. Swan more. I think you really explain how we have to discuss and understand reparations. And let's not forget that reparations is not just a response to slavery, hundreds of years of slavery. It's also a response to the role that the federal government played for generations and generations to keep Black economic resources dampened in a sense. And so reparations is also about the subsidies that Black people paid for building white wealth in this country. Again, it's not just well, this happened to us during slavery. It goes farther than that. I think that if we talk about reparations as a check, I don't see how far that's going to go. But if we talk about reparations, where the community is the unit of analysis, it's a whole different ballgame. To me, reparations would look like something like the following. Boston is going to commit the resources so every public school in Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester has a clean swimming pool, has a modern library, and has the technology that will make sure that digital divides are overcome. To me, that could be a really important reparations program, but there it's the community that's the unit of analysis. And I agree with Dr. Swan, that's not going to bring us into racial nirvana in this country.
Well, they are.
Yeah. Go ahead,
They're
Dr.
working the
Martin.
chat. They're working
Yeah, well,
the chat right
I'm
now.
in it. I'm in it
I
to
love
win
it.
it. I'm in it to win it. And so I'm going to combine 3 chat questions and throw them at both of you and answer. I'm going to start with first, a former chairman of the Urban League, my line brother, Richard Taylor, raised the question about, and the question that we have on our list is, what is the impact of all those people over the time of history who have fought for voting rights and issues of voting rights and against voter suppression, and the work of what was done in Georgia by Stacey Abrams and all the rest? What does that teach us going forward? 2, I'm going to go to a good friend of mine and a colleague, former head of the what was then called the Boston Redevelopment Authority, now the BPDA, Tom O'Brien, asked the question about, hey, folks have been denied, talking about denial of opportunity. Black folks have been kept away from all of the opportunities to get the housing and all of the national programs around housing. And you know, Dr. Jennings, we've talked about those issues. We've been denied over, well, one of the ways that one gets to wealth is by owning a home and the equity that's involved in it. And then the former athletic director and at UMass Boston, Charlie Titus, says, well, hey, look what's going on here. We talked about what happened, and Dr. Motley and I hate to mention that guy by name, that guy who lived on Fifth Avenue in New York and hopefully will be in a jail there. But anyway, we'll talk about that another time. He says, well, what's going to happen with the Republican Party as a result of all that's going on in the past 6 years, all that went on after January, on January 6th, or from November 3rd. So those are the 3 areas, and you're free to touch upon as much of those, but I wanted to throw all of them at you so that I can keep Dr. Motley from getting pushed around after this, and you know that's not true, about what he failed to do in the chat and in the Q&A. So, Dr. Jennings, I'm gonna start with you on those questions.
And I have to say that the questions are empowering to me. The questions are so empowering and so important, things that we really have to think about. And I guess I would say 2 things. One, yes, political mobilization is critically important. It's without political mobilization, without struggle, we're not going to gain anything. At the same time, we also have some potential economic resources that we have to rethink about how to take advantage, positive advantage. I was waiting for one of the questions on the Federal Reserve Bank study showing that a Black family's worth is $8.
Oh yeah, we got that, but you can take that now.
Okay,
we got that question there, but go ahead, take it.
That question always riles me up a little bit, because the focus is on an individual. The focus is on an individual family, and that limits our discourse, our narrative about how to move forward. In zip code 02119, where the Urban League is located, in the year 2017, female-headed households had a buying power of $122 million. So how do we change a situation where this demographic group is simply an economic conduit to move wealth from this side to that side? How do we change our thinking and say, wait a second, $122 million? That means a very, very different narrative than, you know,
$8.
this individual only has $8 worth of wealth, which I'm not saying that's unimportant, saying we have to look at that, but we need to also have a bigger picture when we think about how to move forward economically.
Dr. Swan?
And I agree totally. I'm excited about, you know, the question around Stacey Abrams. I think it's there's a lot to unpack there. You know, I think Stacey Abrams is also part of a broader tradition of gendered organizing at the grassroots level. Even the formation of the first Black Panther Party, not in California, but in Lowndes County, Alabama, was you know, brought apart by the work of SNCC activists, you know, local Black activists in Lowndes County, who were able to get the Black Panther Party on the ticket, and that became a model within the Democratic Party. I think, you know, not only does the Abrams, you know, piece show us a model, but it's the constant question of how do we galvanize the energy of Black protests into actionable, you know, change at the local or grassroots level. Without question, her organizing, you know, tactics were instrumental in kind of fueling this younger energy. And I'm saying younger, not as in young people, but the energy of we need change right now, that we saw reflected in Black Lives Matter protests. I think we need to think about that for the other issues that come up, right? There'll be other, you know, episodes of violence. There'll be other issues that we respond to. But how do we use the energy that typically comes from reactive Black protests to being, you know, progressively thinking forward for structural change? So I think we need to interrogate the unpacking of our organization capabilities much more intentionally, and look at those kind of models and how they could work in a Boston-based context.
So let's go over to a little healthcare for a minute, health and wellness. So, you know, with this rise in COVID, unemployment, domestic violence, food insecurity, business closures, mental illness, and suicide, all have been so prevalent. What are some of the things that you suggest that we can do in that regard? I know I took us away from where you were. You know, we're going to get back to it because I'm analyzing the chat now, and we're going to get right back to it. We have a chairman who's becoming very good at pulling all that stuff out of the chat. So consider this a commercial.
I think I'll take this one.
Yeah.
First, Doc. I think we have to get ahead of the game. We have to create as Black and Brown communities our own agendas on what we think is important, as opposed to what the national media or national structures tell us is important. Because we usually show up at the by the time our problems are nationally mentioned, it's already too late. We know about the mental health issues. We can imagine, you know, the educational crisis that COVID-19 also reflected, the impact it's had on our kids. We should be thinking about who are these kids going to be in another 3 to 5 years,
right?
Like who is going to be this generation? The mental health issues of the parents, the extended family members. I had a number of students who lost family members whose lives were torn apart. They had to become their parents, who were also, you know, frontline workers. The impact that COVID-19 has had on that generation, we need to get ahead of it and think about all these areas you mentioned. Not only addressing the moment of food insecurities and the business closures, but what's this gonna look like in 3 years? And I think that can only work by using the intersectional lens, by having different practitioners from these areas in the same room to talk about what it looked like from their perspective, because often we're siloed and what it looks like in our area. And I think these kind of spaces maybe help build, you know, just kind of bridges for that kind of work, so we can get ahead once again in what we know is coming down the road. My kids are driving me crazy. And I'm sure I'm driving them crazy too. You know, I know as soon as my daughter gets a bad grade, I know it within 5 minutes. I can't imagine what that would have been like for me as a kid. So I'm being facetious, right? But you know, and we're not going crazy, but there are a number of households who are carrying another attention whose parents can't work, who are unemployed, and the kids as well. So we have to get ahead of it.
No, we have to emphasize youth. We have to emphasize youth, and not just because they're the future, you know, as the saying goes, but they really have the potential and the capacity to bring new visions and build new leadership on new, more progressive visions. So whatever we do, whatever strategies, we always have to ask, how is this going to impact? How is this going to empower our youth? And getting back to that Federal Reserve Bank study, and it's actually related to this point, when you look at the fact, the reality, that in Boston today, a good 65, 70% of all children under 5 years of age are Latinx and Black, that's a tremendous resource. That's a tremendous resource. Some people may not want to think about the implications of that, but the implications could be very exciting for the city of Boston. So here we have a tremendous potential resource that we have to work with to move forward beyond COVID-19, beyond the racism, beyond the racial double standards, and really push for that more positive road that we're facing in terms of the two roads that our society is looking at.
Well, I want to, thank you for that, Dr. Motley, for moving in terms of the health issue. But I got to come back. I'm an Aries and I react to things that are said or done. So I got to stay informed. Those who know me know I will. But I take issue with a statement that Paula Robinson Deere put into chat. And she says, this is a great conversation about the politics of inequality among academics. However, it is not a conversation that it can assist grassroots, low-income, elderly, or poor people who are most affected and need to be taught about how economic power and political power works. I'm not going to answer that. I'm going to ask our panelists to react to that. I have my view on that. I disagree with it, but I want to say, listen, as I look at the chat and look at the people who are participating, there are many persons, subject matter experts who are in this area. Abigail Foster's on. I just mentioned Charlie Titus, Richard Taylor, what Paula Robinson Deere does. We're here to discuss the issue. We're not saying we have all the answers, but I want to see if any of you, including Dr. Motley, have a response for Paula Robinson Deere about what this conversation is all about.
Well, my response was going to be to ask the question.
Yeah.
So, because I understand that we have panelists that will be able to respond to that. And I love the fact that that's part of the academy. You have to have that voice to stir the pot to make us dig deeper in the conversation. So I'm so used to that from being a faculty member, as I'm sure they are as well. So, I mean, where are you coming from when you hear that? Either one of you can start.
Well, I can only tell you who I am and what my values are, and all my professional work throughout my entire professional life, quote unquote academic life, has been about strengthening communities. I don't have all the right answers.
Right.
I think I'm right most of the time. But I don't have all the right answers. I'm only kidding.
Well,
but, but I'll leave it at that.
Dr. Smart.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just simply say that, when you do this work, some Dr. Jennings, the work at the end of the day is for the community. So you got to take the hits. You got to take the questions about accountability and audience and reach. And so I appreciate the question. I also think that these kind of forums, you work where you are. We have an hour. If this was all we did, then I would totally agree. But I like to think that it's not all that we do. And I do think we do need more discussion about these issues, but it shouldn't be the only thing we do. You know, we do need to read more books. It shouldn't be the only thing we do. And I think we need to engage, you know, and I think that's one of the things we've also seen from this COVID moment is that these Zoom settings, the audience are also the participatory presence of the audience in the comments. I have a lot of value for. So I would be interested in, you know, going beyond the conversations. Let's forge out, you know, how could the content be useful if you work within those spaces beyond just the hour, you know, Zoom settings that we have. But I appreciate the response and the critique.
Well, you know, one of the things that's going to happen, so we can segue here a little bit, is that May is Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts month. And so as part of that month, we are having a public policy charrette. And that's an opportunity for all the individuals on here to participate in a charretting forum where we could talk about whatever that issue is they want to talk about in the spaces that we will lay out as the subject matter areas. So I'm going to expect that all my colleagues who are Zooming in now, when we give that call, when we beat that drum, to say, come on, let's have that conversation. Now that we've heard from the Secretary of Economics for the state, and we've heard from the National Urban League president, and we've heard from mayors who happen to be women of color from around the state and all, and now we've heard from my partners from the Academy today. Let's mix all that up and let's see that gumbo that we make around these conversations. And so you're going to hear, and these two gentlemen will be part of helping us frame that, not to put you to more work, but helping us frame along with many of the people who are identified in the chat. And so we're so grateful. You know, we're coming up on the end of this conversation. What I'd like you both to do, if you don't mind, any closing comments, and then I'll close the program, okay, that you'd like to make.
For me, only again, that I've learned so much by the conversation and the questions, and we need to have more things and opportunities like this, but I do agree that they always have to be connected to direct community benefit and empowerment. So again, thank you very much for inviting me.
Now, I say similar, and, you know, thanks for having me. And lastly, the Trotter Institute is alive and well. Look out to us as a resource.
And I did say yes to be on your advisory board.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes, sir. And
so
I appreciate your.
I got your note.
Your
I'm on
support.
it. Okay.
And
so,
Charlie, Titus support in
Yeah.
the room, and Dr. Jennings, I'll be following up to pick
Yeah.
your brand about your wisdom
yeah.
as well. So thanks for
Yeah.
having me, to the audience.
So I also want to say, Chairman, is there anything you'd like to say before we close?
No, the only thing I would say is this has been an exhilarating conversation. We will take all of what comes, but I think Dr. Motley, you said it very, very well. We can take conversation and discourse to action. And I know all of the people who are in this panel were persons of action. And we ask those who are watching this and engaged in this program today to join us in that activity. And I think May will be a great time for us to come together. So again, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Swan. Thank you, Dr. Jennings. And of course, thank you to you, Dr. Motley.
I also want to say thank you to all those who participated today and who tuned in. We have gotten more sophisticated around using Q&A and the chats and all that. You know, when we all came to Zoom, none of us knew what we were doing. And so the first program, I didn't even know what chat was, okay? So now we've all moved towards a space where we can do that. We don't take anonymous questions, but we do take them when you put your name to them. So I hope you noticed that. And we're so grateful to all of you who've either added to the chat conversation or added to this conversation by asking the questions. Remember, you can become a member of this movement, become a member of the Urban League of Eastern Massachusetts. And you could do that by visiting our website, www.ulem.org. And you'll get more details on exactly what that means. You know, this Urban League has been available to Boston as historic economic first responders for almost 102 years. I know that sags in comparison to our sister, Newton, who's 110 years old now. But 102 years of trying to be the kind of organization that serves this community in all of its parts of the community has been an amazing journey for this organization. And we thank you for allowing us to be present in your space today. And we're so grateful to all of you. So until next time, we'll see you. Thank you for joining us.
Have a blessed day.
Thanks again.
Bless.